On this episode of Technicolor Blood, we will discuss Aquaman at length. We went to see this movie for you so that we could talk about it.
Yeah, we did it for you. We did so you don't have to.
Technicolor Blood. All right, guys, we saw Aquaman, and we're going to talk about Aquaman at length today. So, Terrence.
Yeah, so we're pretty
late. My
late.
name is Chris. This is Terrence. This is Technicolor Blood. We're going to talk about Aquaman.
We're pretty late to the party. Aquaman's been out for a few weeks. Most of you have probably already seen it, and if you haven't seen it yet, then you have no intention of seeing it. But here we go.
Yes, definitely keep listening, though. So, Aquaman is directed by James Wan. James Wan is, I think, known best for directing one of the Fast and Furious movies, maybe several of them. And I guess generally we start off with our sort of overreaching thoughts of the movie. Just to put a stamp on that at the end. Actually, James Wan, I guess most famously before he got to these bigger movies, he directed the original Saw movie. So that was kind of a big deal. That was a pop cultural phenomenon for a while. Many different sequels afterwards. He also did the original The Conjuring. He did a sequel to Insidious. Obviously, he's kind of made his bank doing horror films. He did Furious 7. Was that the one that was like so wildly successful it sort of shocked everyone? I think that was the one.
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
It like ended up being in the top 10 movies of all time, which was sort of shocking.
Yeah, but then I think the one after that was equally successful.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But yeah, I think he directed the one where they introduced The Rock as a new cast member, and I mean that's box office mojo right there.
Yeah. So James Wan landed this one. Stars obviously Jason Mamoa of Game of Thrones fame, and we talked about him a couple of weeks ago and how affable and great he was on Saturday Night Live. So I think just off the top here, the reason that we were a little bit late to seeing this is because it just didn't really look very good to either one of us.
Yeah, the trailers for it did not inspire confidence, and it's another DC movie, and DC movies have overall been pretty wretched.
Yeah, if you know us and you know the show, you know that we tend to bring up DC a lot, and we want them to be good. We want them to be good, but haven't seen it yet. So Aquaman did not change that, not for me, and I think not for you. And so I guess we'll just start off overall. Where to start? This was sort of a mess from the jump. It's all over the place visually. The acting wasn't good. I'm sorry. I mean, I like a lot of the cast members. I like Amber Heard. I like Jason Momoa. Willem Dafoe is an actor
Yes.
who somehow got cast in this.
Right.
So the acting was all over the place. But the thing I think if I had to pinpoint my biggest gripe, it would probably be the dialogue. I mean, there's a lot of gripes. Dialogue was probably number one for me. Story-wise, I feel like I'm always the first one to say, hey, we shouldn't lower the bar for comic book movies. But for Aquaman, I mean, it's a fish guy who saves the world in the water. So what really did I expect? I guess better than what I got for some reason. But aside from just the overarching story, the dialogue in this movie just constantly had me dropping my head and releasing heavy sighs into the theater.
Yeah, from a story standpoint, this movie essentially tells the exact same story that Black Panther did. Aquaman is, the rightful heir to the throne of his kingdom, and he's got this brother or half brother or whatever who wants to knock him out of the way and actually be the king and
Played
start
by
a
Patrick
war.
Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, literally everything that happens in Black Panther also happens in Aquaman, whereas Black Panther, elevates that, age-old storyline and brings it into the modern world. Aquaman just turns it into this like big, brightly colored mess that just sort of keeps going and going and going.
All the colors.
Yeah, all the colors. And, you can tell that from the trailers. And so you know what to expect going in. But you remember that in the previous outings where Jason Momoa has played Aquaman, he's been very charming, very entertaining. Like his humor has really stood out. And so you kind of hope that you'll get a lot of that in this movie. And yeah, the movie might just be a noisy machine, but along the way, you'll be charmed and entertained by Jason Momoa. That doesn't happen. Like he's ground down by the visuals. He's ground down by this sort of a directing style that doesn't really particularly have any interest in what actors are doing.
Yeah.
And he can't save it. And in fact, he just becomes another part of the problem, I think.
I can't disagree with any of that. I didn't hate Momoa in this. Now maybe I just I've admitted that I'm just a big fan of his after SNL and just being such a good guy. And like you said, he in his previous turns as Aquaman and the other movies, he's been sort of like, oh, he was kind of refreshing.
Right.
So he kind of felt like he was winking the whole time, and some of the other characters did too, but he didn't really have to do anything in this movie except show up, snicker, and kick the shit out of someone.
Yeah,
it was just a constant loop of that.
I feel like 90% of his acting was just to strike a dramatic pose.
Right. Yeah.
Stand with your arms bowed out.
And we've talked about before how certain directors are really good at shooting their actors, and I know that sounds like just sort of a general statement, but specifically, Spielberg has a way that he shoots Indiana Jones, especially like when he first shows up on screen.
Right.
Great directors know how to introduce a character and how to shoot the actors. And I felt like James Wan was conscious of that, and he tried to do that, but I just did not like any of the choices he made.
Yeah, I didn't either. And, you can't really put too much stock into this, but I always notice what the first shot of every film is. Mm-hmm. And some directors like to make it something, attempt to make it something iconic that'll like really stand out and usher you into this movie as something special. Mm-hmm. Off the top of my head, a great example of that is the movie Thelma and Louise, right? The opening shot of that is this vast, beautiful landscape of the southwest of the United States. And when you first see it, it's in this sepia tone color. And then the camera slowly pans to the side. And as it does, it fades into actual color of the modern day. And it's a great intro shot to a film. The opening shot of the Aquaman movie is a close-up on a shutter banging against the side of a building.
Yeah.
I couldn't help but think, that doesn't portend well.
Yeah, in my brain, when I saw that, I thought to myself, okay, James Wan is a horror director. And that's exactly what he was doing at the beginning of that movie. It was just like he couldn't pull away from his horror roots, because that's a very horror film kind of a shot.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah, that's a good point.
So yeah, I thought Momoa was fine for what it was, but he could not save this. No one could save this. I guess I don't think we mentioned yet that Nicole Kidman was in this movie playing his mother.
Yeah, and every scene she was in just should have been cut out of the movie.
Yeah, there was a lot of extraneous stuff. This is a 2 hour and 21 minute movie. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think maybe this is just a thing with you and I, but I feel like anytime we see a movie that's overly long, we always come out saying that movie could have easily been 20 minutes shorter. That movie could have been 40 minutes shorter.
Yeah. By
literally lopping out entire storylines and also just taking every scene on its own merit and cutting those down. I feel like, man, if there's an extended cut of this movie on the DVD, like I feel like he didn't leave anything on the cutting room floor. Undoubtedly, there's hundreds of hours.
Oh, sure.
But I just feel like every scene stretched on too long, and even sometimes where it had stretched on too long, and I thought to myself, okay, this is finally the end of the scene, and I would keep going.
Yeah.
Especially the fight scenes, man. Just so much overdone, overly stylized, Michael Bay style fight scenes. I watching this movie, like I couldn't unsee Michael Bay's fingers all over this. Like I feel like James Wan's preparation from transitioning from horror to an action film was just him watching a shit ton of Michael Bay movies, which is interesting because when you read interviews and you hear comments from James Wan, he talks about movies that we really like. but he didn't glean a lot from those, I don't feel like.
Well, one really jarring difference between him and Michael Bay is, Michael Bay hates green screen, right? He avoids it as much as possible. This entire film is green screen. There's not a single scene in this movie that doesn't have some sort of green screen, whether it's a set extension or the entire set.
Yeah. I just feel like for me, the major thing that ties James Wan's style to Michael Bay's style for me is that in every scene, especially in the fight scenes, the idea of the director is not to tell the most effective story. Because I mean, every scene is in and of itself a little story within the movie, right? And every time they're setting up a scene, I feel like they're coming at it from the perspective of how can I make this the most intense? How can I make this the most crazy thing? Camera movement all over the place, really getting an intense viewing experience. And just as far as like having a coherent storyline for what's even going on within the scene itself, or being able to follow where the action is coming from, what's causing it, what's going on around the characters, like no consideration for that whatsoever.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think he particularly cared about any of the characters, to be honest with you. The two movies that this film sort of reminded me of as I was watching it was Tron Legacy from several years ago, which most people probably don't remember. There's no reason you should. But it's another movie where the acting is super dry and uninspired and the story is real muddy. And so you just forget about all of that. But the director had a lot of visual style, and so if you remember anything from that movie at all, it's just the visuals. And I feel like this is another one of those movies, like, bad acting, lame story, but the director had a bottomless pit of money and he used every single dollar of it on special effects. And so, you're going to walk away maybe remembering the crazy sea monsters fighting each other, or the plethora of underwater explosions that look like the explosions that would happen outside of water.
Right.
Yeah. So most of the movie takes place underwater, but they pay no attention to that. The physics of water never play any sort of impact in the story.
Yeah.
Nothing looks like it's underwater at all.
Right.
It all just looks like it's taking place up on dry land. It was a weird...
Like the way the characters moved was weird.
Yeah, all of it was a weird visual decision that the director made that I guess presumably in the sequels, the next director is kind of stuck with. And then the other movie that it reminded me of a whole lot was Peter Jackson's Hobbit trilogy, where it's just massively bloated high fantasy, right? Like they wanted to create this underwater world as this massive new landscape, full of strange new creatures like elves and dwarves, and these live underground and these live in the sea trees and these ride on seahorses and these, have turned crabs into tanks and stuff like that. And so much of the movie is just this dull travelogue where you go from one kingdom to another, seeing like the newest CG creature that particular region of the undersea landscape has to offer. Right.
It's just like set piece after set piece after set piece with no consideration for the story and how it intertwines the characters. It's just literally, and it happened the same way on, as they call it, the surface world. Everything that happened under the water was just like you said. It was like this one big set piece where it's the fish people, and then it's like the crab army, like you said, like one to the next, where clearly the idea was, oh, I have this cool idea for a set piece. Oh, I have another cool idea for a set piece. Nothing to do with the actual story. And then on land, literally it's like what was that thing like several years ago, geocaching or whatever it was, like Jason Mamoa or Aquaman and the Amber Heard character that I can't recall. Yeah, Mara. Literally just go from place to place like they're on some sort of a Disney adventure where they find the clue and the clue says, okay, now we have to go to the Sahara Desert. Oh, now we have to go to Sicily.
Yeah, it definitely has a little bit of National Treasure mixed into it.
Yeah. So just totally incoherent. But I guess before I forget, I wanted to go back to the dialogue. So one of the very first things they teach you in screenwriting is to avoid on-the-nose dialogue. On-the-nose dialogue, for those of you that are listening that don't know what that is just basically when there's something that's happening in the story, and rather than showing it with action or showing it with, good dialogue, you just literally enunciate exactly what's going on. You say the thing that's happening, and it's very obvious.
Yeah. You tell the audience the thing they're supposed to be getting from that scene.
Yes, you're telling them the thing that they should be able to get if you're any good without you actually having them to enunciate it.
Right.
This is a thing that has plagued almost every bad movie in the history of bad movies. And yet, when you go and you learn about screenwriting, it is one of the first things I would imagine on the first day that you learn. Because, we've both studied screenwriting, not necessarily in a classroom situation, but I can't imagine that if I was a screenwriting professor, I would write that on the chalkboard on day one. And yet, even in good movies sometimes, there's all this on-the-nose dialogue. And this movie was just one after another, after another, after another. 30 minutes in, I was exhausted by the on-the-nose dialogue. Yeah. And it just, I hate that the bar is low with fantasy and sci-fi and comic book movies where everyone's just like, it's a comic book movie. No, you don't have to say the thing that's obviously happening. You can come up with a different way to write it, or you can show them instead of telling them.
Yeah. All of that is absolutely true. So let me ask you this. Was there anything redeeming in this movie for you? Was there anything you actually enjoyed, or is this the worst movie you've ever seen?
It's not the worst movie I've ever seen because I've seen Dreamcatcher and several others, but that's for another episode. I will say this. I thought they at least, I don't want to use the term good job, but they definitely have pivoted on their quest, I think, to get away from the Zack Snyder era of DC. Now, Zack Snyder is still a executive producer on this movie, but obviously he did not have the creative input on it that he's had in the past with the ones that he's directed and produced. So, they got away from the dark, brooding, the lack of color, the monochromatic look, and they went towards, they went to the colors. It was a lot more fun. They were trying to make it more fun, not so damn serious. And they accomplished those things, but just because they do those things doesn't mean they did it well. So I feel like it's a positive step away from the Zack Snyder universe of DC films. But now that I've had some time to sit with it, I'm still not 100% sure I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think I'm pretty close to being able to declare that this was actually my least favorite DC movies. And I've seen Justice League and I've seen Batman versus Superman.
Right. Yes.
So it just, man, I feel like either there's some sort of a middle ground there, or James Wan and the writers and all the filmmakers with this were just the wrong folks to take it in that direction.
Yeah. Like you say, on the one hand, it does pivot away from Zack Snyder. Nobody broods in this movie. There's no brooding, so that's a nice change of pace.
It's almost like they made that as a conscious decision. Let's avoid that.
Yeah. It's one of those movies where the sum of its parts do not make for a satisfying whole.
Yeah.
And really, the individual parts aren't particularly good. Like, the score is noticeably bad. And the special effects, like, they vary widely from scene to scene. There'll be some sequences that look really, really good, and you're genuinely impressed by them. And then there'll be others that look like, you're watching somebody play a video game on their home, PlayStation 4 or something.
Yeah.
And it's like, obviously, for movies like this, there's so many effects required that multiple effects companies have to do them. And some of those companies are really good and some of those companies are not as good. And that's why you get movies with inconsistent special effects. But it was very glaring in this film, I thought. Like, there were entire scenes that starting with the very opening shot of that particular scene, you could tell, oh, this is a different effects company and they're not going to do a very good job.
Yeah.
And I found myself really noticing that throughout the film. It was distracting me from what I should have been paying attention to, which was the bad acting.
Right. Yeah. And another thing that I think plagued this movie, and this kind of ties back to what you were talking about with all the big set pieces of, the crab warriors and people saddling sharks and all that stuff. There's a thing that happens, I think, with comic book movies, and maybe this is just me because I like comic books fine. Like, I grew up on a handful of different comics, but I wasn't like a massive comic book fan. And a lot of the movies now that are inspired by comic books, I don't know the original source material, but I enjoy seeing the movies. It's fun, big event movies, blah, blah, blah. But I just feel like there's a disconnect with some filmmakers where they don't realize that there are just some things that work great in a comic book that do not translate to filmed entertainment on the screen.
Yeah.
And this movie, to me, was completely riddled with those. The best example I can come up with is when they first introduced the Black Manta character, when he showed up with his full costume, I bursted out into laughter at that.
Yeah.
Like it looked ridiculous to me.
Yeah, it's stupid.
Yeah, and I'm sure it was great and it works great in the comic, but in the movie it looks ludicrous and I just had to laugh at it. And it reminds me of that story we talked about with Bird Box where Sandra Bullock was like, I don't want to see the creature. I want to see it for the first time when we're shooting the scene. And she turned and she saw it and she busted out laughing.
Yeah.
That's how I felt with the Black Manta character. And I just don't understand how people can't get that just because it's in the source material. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work on screen. I don't think Ridley Scott or, Alfonso Cuarón or any great director could have done anything with that design because it just doesn't translate to the screen well.
The one person off the top of my head who I think could work with it would be Del Toro, right? Because he loves those kind of weird, silly looking designs.
The whole, I mean, based on the fact that the entire rest of the look of the movie would be different as well, then yes. But I just don't feel like Del Toro wouldn't have gone over the top with all the rest of them. I feel like you have to, I know you're trying to make this gigantic, huge scale movie, a $200 million budget, so you have to fill it with all this stuff. But there was just too much sensory overload of all the different stuff undersea. And there's so much to look at. And for me, like everything I'm looking at, I'm kind of laughing at, an army of saddled sharks, the little crab tank army. Like I understand, like it's imaginative and whatever, but all of it together is just this malaise of, you get what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah. If there had been less so that each of those things seemed more spectacular, that would have helped. But it was all just everything that was introduced became a throwaway. Like early in the film, you get introduced to the bad guys as stormtroopers, right? And again, I snickered at the design of their costumes.
Yeah, real bulky, right? And I feel like they're going to bump into each other and fall
down. But then
down.
like 20 minutes later, you're introduced to a whole nother level of stormtrooper armor, right? Like from like the elite version of them or whatever, who have their own special armor, and that's silly as well. So it's like this ever escalating war for this silly armor that, as each character, reaches a new level of drama in the film, they get a costume change, which makes their costume even more outrageous until you get to the point at the end of the film during the climax where the costumes are so outrageous that they can't even make real ones. Like the two actors clearly are wearing motion capture suits and their costumes are just CG.
Right.
Like, I mean, just think about that for a moment, that this is a film that the costumes the characters keep getting more and more ludicrous to the point that they can't even physically make them anymore. Right. And they have to make them out of a computer-generated simulation. I mean, that just almost wraps up this movie as a whole.
So what about for you, before we get too far away from it, what redeeming qualities did you pull from this?
Well, I mean, if I was forced to pull something out, I would say that despite my criticism just now for the costumes, there is a lot of really ingenious production design in this film. We see tons and tons of different kingdoms and locations in this undersea Middle Earth that they go visit. And, some of them are really cool looking. And, whether or not they're executed the best, maybe not. But you could tell that the designs were original and they were pretty cool to look at. I kept thinking, if we had seen all of these settings, not in one movie, but over the course of 3 movies, and they came from a director with like a little more visual style, I think I would have really enjoyed seeing them.
Another thing that I just couldn't get away from was, and again, this is something I brought up before with movies in general, not just comic book movies, but the scale. So in this one movie, they're packing in the storyline where not only is the main group of the from Atlantis deciding to go to war with the surface world, but Atlantis is going to the other kingdoms and trying to unite them, which ultimately leads into an all-out war between them under the sea that no one seems to notice except for a throwaway line where they say, we've detected several explosions under the sea. Is this movie happening in 1910 or is it happening in present day? The idea that all this is going on and there's just no reaction from the surface world except for like this crazy guy who keeps showing up on news programs, like pounding his fist on the table saying Atlantis is real and it all exists. And everyone's just like, there you go with that. They literally say, there you go with your crazy stuff again. Once again, super on the nose dialogue.
Right. Well,
and all that stuff is going on and there's plenty of technology to detect it. For all that to happen, and then for them to have to get to that point under the sea, and then they're going to attack the surface world, like just too much. It's just too much.
I mean, keep in mind, this is a movie too where we travel to the Earth's core, and in the Earth's core,
that's right,
is like a hidden sea with a beautiful tropical island floating in the middle of it, and it's all illuminated by like giant crystals that are so high up in the sky it just looks like sunlight.
Yeah, it's like the end of the Goonies when they like go into that big area and there's a big ship and there's this opening in this huge mountain or whatever. Like, what? This is the surface of this is the core of the Earth.
I mean, when we got to that point in the movie where you're just like so far through the looking glass,
right.
All I could think about was this is supposed to be taking place on the same planet Earth that Batman inhabits. You know, right. Where Batman is just beating up goons in alleyways. Meanwhile, Aquaman is traveling to the core of the Earth, which is not molten lava or whatever, but it's like, this, secret Eden hidden in the middle of the planet.
It's science now going on there.
Yeah. I mean, it's so... And I realize people are like, well, listen, it's just a popcorn movie. You turn your brain off at the door and you enjoy it for what it is. And I'm like, okay, I get that. And if you enjoyed this movie, well, good for you. But you have a direct comparison with the Marvel films, which are also just popcorn movies that you're supposed to turn your brain off and enjoy. But those movies are internally coherent. Mm-hmm. They're telling very, very simple stories, but they know they're simple stories, and it allows them to tell them really well. Aquaman was telling, I don't even know what it was telling. I mean, it was a mess. It was just everything that they could come up with, they just threw at you. And you end up with this big, colorful, swirling mass of computer-generated lights and noise. And I'm like, okay, if you enjoyed it, fine. But you really, I hope, can discern the difference between the Aquaman film and the Black Panther film and get that one is vastly superior to the other.
Yeah. Octopus Drummer.
Yes, that did happen as well.
Yeah. So I want to touch on just a couple little things here before we go on. James Wan, you brought up this, I think you might have brought up the soundtrack real briefly. James Wan famously, well, not famously, but on our show we talked about it. He compared the inspiration for the score to Aquaman to the Blade Runner score, the original Blade Runner from 1982, done by Vangelis, which is one of the, for me, I think for both of us, one of the great soundtracks, or one of the great scores. And man, I just don't know what makes James Wan's ears work versus what makes my ears work, because that is not at all what I heard.
Yeah, I don't get that comparison in the least.
Yeah, there is nothing. The only thing I can draw together with those two movies is the fact that Blade Runner, in parts, in the downtown shots, had a lot of colors in it. That's the end of the comparisons. So again, James Wan, like I said, I feel like his whole style is reminiscent of so many directors that I'm not such a big fan of. But when he talks about his movies, he references things like Blade Runner. He had a quote about how the Octopus Drummer was based on him. Basically, he watched Mad Max Fury Road, another movie we love, and said, if they can have a guy playing a flaming guitar, I can have an octopus drummer. I mean, what? His ears don't work the same way as mine, and like the way that I hear things and apply logic to them doesn't work the same way for him. I realize that he's a successful multimillionaire director who's had hundreds of millions of box office, and I'm just some damn schlub with a podcast.
Right.
But I can't reconcile those things.
Yeah.
He clearly has influences from great movies, but when I see what he does, I don't know. I just feel like he's established himself as a horror director. He's wildly successful at it, and he's made some good horror movies. And I don't know, like, if he ends up directing the second one, I don't know if he thinks this movie was amazing or if he thinks, okay, I can do some things better if he ends up directing the second. I'm just kind of at a loss.
Yeah, I don't know. The one thing we do know for sure is this movie has been definitely successful enough that we're absolutely going to get another one.
No doubt about it.
And he's gonna get the first offer on it, so it'll be up to him whether or not he wants to come back and do another.
Okay, so before we get on to our letter ratings grades for this movie, I'm going to put the same question to you that I sort of put out for myself earlier. Where do you rank this in the DC movie universe?
Oh man,
at least for now.
Okay, so it's difficult to say because I've seen the DC movies only one time each. Mm-hmm. I've never felt a desire to go back and rewatch any of them. I think I might have rewatched the first Man of Steel film.
I have seen that one twice.
I could not believe that it was as bad as I remembered it being, right. And it turned out to be every bit as bad as I remembered it being. So again, with the exception of Wonder Woman, none of those movies are good. Mm-hmm. So how bad it is among all the other bad movies, I mean, it's fresh for me. So there's a part of me that wants to say it's the worst of all, but in reality, it's probably just somewhere in the middle. It's just in the mix of all of those bad, middling films that they've put out.
I just look at it like this. I think I could pull more, at least small positive things from Batman versus Superman and Justice League. I can't believe I'm saying this out loud. Than I could from Aquaman. So I guess like in the micro view, having so recently seen Aquaman, I feel like it's my least favorite of the DC movies, but I'm also not going to go back and watch the Batman movies.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe just time will sort of make this congeal in my brain, and I'll have a better opinion of it. But for right now, that's where I put it. So I guess that takes us straight into our grades for this. I mean, I'm not trying to be too over the top, but for me, if there's not if this movie, for me, the way I've been talking about it for 30 minutes, if this isn't an F, then there is no F, I guess is the best way for me to put it. Now, this also has to, I think you and I both sort of grade movies on a scale also of what the filmmakers are trying to accomplish, what kind of, like, I guess, for instance, like, we're not going to hold a $1 million budget tiny little movie to the same standard as we are a $200 million budget, because you only have so much to work with. You know, you might be a first time filmmaker. Like, when people have resources and they've got, you know, cachet and all that, I grade them a lot harder.
Sure.
So, but I can't give this anything but an F. I'm just going to give it an F.
Okay. I would give this movie a D, not an F. And let me tell you why. Because when I see F movies, I get up and walk out of the theater. The fact that I sat through this movie all the way to the end means it, in my mind, it's not an F, but it's a D.
Let me just ask you a little insider question here. If we didn't have a podcast to do about it, would you have walked out of the movie? I would have considered it.
I did consider it, actually. There was a point in that movie, I would say 20 to 25 minutes into it, where I seriously thought maybe we should just leave the theater right now.
Try to salvage the night.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
But I mean, you know, movie tickets are so expensive, and, you know, we didn't go to this movie alone. We went with people, and, you know, obviously we're not going to.
Who enjoyed it less than we did, probably.
Yeah. But I mean, during the movie, you don't know for sure, and you don't want to like be like, hey, let's leave. And they're like, I'm liking this.
Right. I mean, we deserved it, so we knew what we were getting into.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. Let me ask you one last question before we wrap this up. Was there anything in this movie that surprised you? Good, bad, or indifferent, but just.
I mean, I'm honestly, I'm not trying to be funny here, but I expected this to be bad, and it was actually worse than I expected it to be. So I'm not trying to get a laugh out of that, but I sort of had a baseline. Yeah. And I did not expect to come out of that movie asking myself, was this the worst DC movie?
Right.
Also, I guess I thought I'd get a little bit more out of Jason Mamoa, but I don't really blame him for that. I blame the director.
Sure,
I mean,
absolutely.
I blame the director for everything with every movie, because at the end of the day, it's the director.
Yeah.
You know, they're in charge of everything.
There's a reason they have a credit that says a film by this person.
And that's why their name is the last one in the credits, and the first one, the last one at the beginning, you know, before the movie starts, and the first credit when the movie ends. I mean,
and
it's on them.
We're not saying that that's right, but directors get all the credit when a movie is good.
Right.
So they need to get all the blame when a movie is bad.
Totally agree. And we do that with directors we like too.
Absolutely.
So on the other side of that, anything that surprised you about the movie?
So there was one thing that kind of caught me off guard, and that is there were no cameos from any of the other DC superheroes.
Yeah, I didn't even think of that.
Yeah, in all the other DC movies, a lot better than they do with the early Marvel movies, is they've really tried to tie them together, and you always have one of the other characters pop up, not just as like an additional scene after the credits or whatever, but like somewhere inside the movie,
Sure.
you know, there's always been some crossover. There really wasn't, that I can recall, any of that anywhere in this movie, and that really surprised me.
Yeah, now that you say that, it's sort of a gaping hole in that movie because they do it in all of them.
Yeah, and I mean,
that's how Aquaman came on the scene.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. And I get that they, you know, they're trying to move away from like the Zack Snyder version of those films. You know, Wonder Woman was like a step away, Aquaman is like 2 steps away. But I don't see why that would impact the desire to keep those films all tied together.
I mean, that's just a hallmark of comic book movies in general.
Yeah, and I mean,
even Zack Snyder thing.
Honestly, I was looking forward to it. I wanted to see one of the other characters, especially in the kind of ludicrous, over the top nature of that film.
Right.
I just wanted another character to pop up and be like, "What the hell?"
Yeah, that would have been fun to see. You know, Batman thrown into that for 2 seconds.
Right, yeah,
Or Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman. You know, her hair would have looked amazing underwater.
Yeah, well, yes. But I mean, this would have been a great opportunity for them, like, you know, kind of the other second tier characters. Like Aquaman is, I think, probably a little bit of a second tier character.
Oh,
but,
absolutely.
You've got like the Flash and the Cyborg characters that they had in Justice League. Either one of them could have easily just popped up for a second.
Yeah. Or like, you know, on the surface, like maybe he runs into the kid who plays Shazam in the Shazam movie, since that's the next movie that's coming out. Like, not even as Shazam, but just like a cameo as a kid.
Yeah, that would have been fantastic.
Yeah.
This is now making me wonder if like I missed something and this movie takes place before the other films, or there's something going on with the timeline that I didn't catch on to.
Yeah, yeah. At TechBloodPod on Twitter if you want to yell at us about that.
Yeah, yeah. If you can explain what happened, please let me know.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting point there. All right, well, if you liked Aquaman or you didn't like Aquaman and you're still listening, we appreciate that. I hope that we discussed some interesting things, that we didn't just bash the thing here, that we had some actual thought behind it and give you reasons for it, not just, this is trash. That's what we sort of aspire to do here, even when we don't like a movie, which we clearly did not with this one.
And if we didn't do that, if you guys were just bashing on this movie, I mean, let us know.
Absolutely.
Just definitely dig in.
Yep, hit us up on Twitter at TechBloodPod, or if you like what you heard, you could give us a review on iTunes. That'd be very helpful for us to continue to grow the audience, and we will see you on the next one.